The confrontation between Israel and Iran has been ongoing for many, many years. And over that time, as we've covered on the channel, it's seen escalations and de-escalations, drone and missile attacks, proxy actions. Then, on the 13th of June, things crossed yet another threshold, with the slow-burning shadow war suddenly becoming about as close as you can get to all-out conventional war between two countries that don't actually share a land border. Apparently assisted by the work of commando and sabotage operations, the Israeli Air Force appears to have quickly cracked open Iran's air defense network and began striking targets, including in the capital Tehran and even the far east of the country. Meanwhile, Iran has salvoed off literally hundreds of medium-range ballistic missiles against targets in Israel, subjecting the Israeli missile defense system and its stockpile of anti-missile interceptors to its greatest test to date. And so today, as strikes continue, 2025 sees yet another conventional state-on-state war. I'm going to do my best, working with the information we have available, to answer three critical questions. In broad strokes, what's happened so far? What might international observers learn from it? And as we observe what may well be the world's first true nuclear threshold war, what might come next, especially in the context of a US decision to launch a direct strike against Iran's nuclear infrastructure? To do that, I'll work through in sequence, starting with the way in which the events of 2023 and 2024 arguably helped shape the conditions for this Israeli operation, what we know about the Israeli air campaign and the Iranian ballistic missile attacks so far, the damage those efforts have likely done, and the challenges they seem to face. Then we'll close out by looking at a couple of key dynamics. We'll cover a bit of history on the Iranian nuclear program and introduce the recent US operation, Midnight Hammer, but we'll leave most of the details there and some of the thornier questions around things like non-proliferation risk and what might potentially come next for a future episode. And instead at that point close by zooming out to make some broader observations about the campaign as we saw it up to that point. Because given the way this has all been going, I strongly suspect this will eventually end up being a two-part episode. Do keep in mind as we go through this that, as I've said in the past, I'm not a Middle East expert. My intention then is to focus pretty squarely on the military and military-industrial elements, because even with that relatively narrow focus, I'd argue there's a lot worth unpacking here. Okay, so before we jump into the quite dramatic events we've just witnessed, I think we need to go back to 2023 and 2024, because I think there's a strong argument to suggest that the conditions for what we just saw were really set over the course of the last 2 years. If you want a bit of a refresher on some of the key events since October 2023, I have done 2 videos over the time period, but one of the key elements to focus on today is the significant uptick in Israeli military activity that we've seen since those October 2023 attacks. In humanitarian terms, I'd argue the period since October 2023 has been marked by immense and compounding suffering. For the people of Gaza in particular, the outcomes have been catastrophic. According to UN estimates, a majority of buildings in the Strip have been damaged or destroyed, hunger is rife, and conditions for much of the surviving population, many of whom are internally displaced, have reportedly become increasingly desperate. While much of the incredible humanitarian cost has been borne by the people of Gaza, however, I'd argue the strategic costs for Iran have steadily mounted. As we discussed in the past, Tehran's primary methods for power projection and deterrence against Israel have long been multifaceted. They relied both on their ballistic missile arsenal on one hand, but also their network of proxies on the other. And over the last better part of 2 years, that proxy network has taken significant damage. Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon have both been militarily weakened, much of their leadership eliminated, and while the Houthis in Yemen remain active and relevant, they have been on the receiving end of strikes and expended a significant number of munitions. So, to greatly oversimplify, if in the past Iran might have been able to threaten during any escalation scenario with Israelis to call up Hezbollah and get them to start firing rockets into Israel, both to help overstress the Israeli missile defense system and to distract Israeli military power, including the Israeli Air Force, come June 2025, the Hezbollah leadership probably aren't in a position to answer their phones in the same way they once were. That arguably left Tehran in a position where it was more reliant on its own missile and air defense capabilities for deterrence and defense. But again, both of those took a hit in that 2023-2024 period. At the time, Iran fired several hundred medium-range ballistic missiles against Israel, missiles which presumably aren't available to be fired now. And in response to those missile strikes, Israel at the time launched a number of long-range airstrikes into Iranian territory, with the primary apparent targets being Iranian air defense systems. Visual evidence of exactly how much damage Israel did with those strikes in October 2024 is still relatively limited, but we did subsequently see a number of senior figures make some pretty significant claims. The UK's Chief of the Defence Staff, for example, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, is reported to have said the following of the Israeli strikes, quote, "I won't go into detail, but in October's retaliatory strikes against Iran, Israel used more than 100 aircraft, carrying fewer than 100 munitions, and with no aircraft getting within 100 miles of the target in the first wave. And that took down nearly the entirety of Iran's air defence system. It has destroyed Iran's ability to produce ballistic missiles for a year and left Tehran with a strategic dilemma in how it responds." End quote. A number of other figures seem to indicate the primary target wasn't Iran's air defence capabilities full stop, but rather its long-range air defence systems, primarily its Russian-origin S-300s. Realistically, given that Russia's circumstances have mostly precluded it being an ideal arms supplier since 2022, it seems highly unlikely the Iranians would have been able to entirely replace those destroyed or damaged systems over the course of less than a year. Meaning that when we saw recent Israeli airstrikes begin, it might have benefited from a kind of head start when it came to the destruction of Iran's air defence system. So Tehran was already suffering from diminished proxies, a partially depleted missile magazine, and the Israeli Air Force apparently managing to get some pre-work in when it came to the whole SEAD-DEAD thing. But there's also one other critical piece of the puzzle that I think is worth highlighting. We've previously talked about the fall of Bashar in Syria as a major strategic loss for the Russian Federation. What we haven't talked about as much is how much of a strategic disaster it was from the Iranian perspective. Al-Assad's government had received significant support from Tehran, and from an Iranian perspective, having that ally in place achieved at least two key objectives. It provided the primary logistics route that Iran could use to send supplies and reinforcements overland to proxies like Hezbollah in Lebanon, while at the same time adding another military layer, if you like, between Israel and Iran proper. To put it generously, the Syrian Arab Army may never have been a top-tier force, but from an Iranian perspective it was a friendly one, and it did have some air defence systems. The regime was also very closely aligned with Russia, which had its own air defence systems in the country. And as long as that was the case, any Israeli Air Force overflights the country needed to satisfy at least one of two criteria. They needed to be stealthy, survivable, or backed by enough deterring firepower that no one would take a shot at them. So think potentially F-35s operating in a clean configuration, or they needed to operate with the de facto permission of Moscow, lest those longer-range Russian air defence systems that we know were in the country decide to take a shot. The fall of the Syrian government, the destruction of a lot of the military's old equipment, and the withdrawal of Russian forces dramatically changed that situation, especially from an air defence perspective. The air defence threat was much diminished, Russia's presence was diminished, and to put it lightly, the new government wasn't exactly full of warm and fuzzy feelings towards Tehran. So while for the Syrian people, that revolution meant a new government and a new potential future, for Israel and this specific operation, it meant the possibility of opening up a new air corridor, where Israeli aircraft en route to Iran could potentially fly much more freely through Syrian airspace, potentially even to the extent of bringing very vulnerable platforms like tankers into Syrian airspace to support forward operations. We do have some visual evidence and reporting to suggest the Israelis are doing air refuelling operations over Syria, and the Iraqi government, which also, like the Syrian government, lacks much in the way of advanced air defence systems, has publicly complained to the Security Council about the repeated violation of their airspace by the Israeli Air Force, suggesting an Israeli air corridor for most of its attacks on Iran that looks something roughly like this. An aerial causeway, if you like, where there's a relatively limited surface-to-air threat, enabling the IAF to pull off the operation that it has. The key point here is that while our attention might focus on air operations from June 2025 onwards, I'd argue the process of setting the conditions that enable those operations go back the better part of 2 years, as global events and military actions steadily stripped away the layers of defence and deterrence that had previously served to at least mostly protect the Iranian homeland, and helped open them up to the kind of air operation we've just seen. If there's a lesson there, it's potentially how wide-ranging the ripple effects of strategic events can go. If not for February 2022 and Russia's distraction, Assad's government may never have fallen, and the diplomatic and military constraints on Israel's air offensive might have looked much, much different. Without October 2023 and the subsequent impacts on Hezbollah, Hamas and the Houthis, the striking power and deterrence values of Iran's proxy network might have been much more significant. Although how exactly that may have shaped Israeli politics and decision-making is ultimately impossible to know. Which brings us to the operation we just witnessed, and I want to focus on day one in particular to start with, because I think there's a strong argument to suggest that if it were not for the fact that Ukraine launched Operation Spider's Web using infiltrated drones to strike Russian strategic bombers, we'd be discussing what Israel just did in a much more innovative sense. What appears to have happened is that as part of the initial Israeli operation, we saw a lot of behind-the-lines action, specifically the infiltration of things like drones and precision weapons into Iranian territory before hostilities began to attack vulnerable, critical Iranian targets, think surface-to-air missile launchers and things like that. In terms of evidence for what we just saw, we have material from both sides. The Israelis have released video claimed to be of Israeli commandos operating in Iranian territory using drones and precision weapons and striking targets like air defense systems. Meanwhile, the Iranians have claimed that there was a serious Mossad presence. For example, the country's police chief claimed that several vehicles carrying mini drones and some tactical drones had been discovered in the country's capital. He also said, quote, "A number of traders are trying to engage the country's air defense by flying some mini drones." The Iranians also claimed separately that security forces had discovered a multi-story drone factory that had been operating in Tehran, which is obviously a major discovery but does raise some significant questions. Like, how come nobody noticed the multi-story drone facility being run by a foreign intelligence agency in the national capital? And how was it only discovered apparently after those drones had been deployed en masse to attack critical Iranian targets? What Israeli sources seem to indicate happened is something akin to the Ukrainian model. Over the course of some time before the operation, drones were assembled in Iranian territory, which were then distributed and used for simultaneous attacks against critical targets. In this case, not strategic bombers, but instead things like air defense systems. Another style of system that appears to have been used were remote-controlled anti-tank guided missiles, specifically from the Spike family. Compared to a drone of the style the Ukrainians use, that sort of system would have its advantages and disadvantages. It's obviously a more dedicated military good, and you're not going to be able to covertly assemble it in an Iranian factory. Someone's going to notice, hopefully, if you're building anti-tank guided missiles, as opposed to, civilian drones that you happen to strap some explodium to. But on the other hand, as purpose-built weapon systems with specific warheads against certain targets, they're likely to be more reliable, harder to intercept, and more effective. A key point here is the world appears to have gotten a second lesson in about as many months on the danger of small, very lethal precision weapon systems being successfully infiltrated into a country and then used to attack soft targets, critical targets, by surprise. And while it's not clear exactly how many Iranian air defense systems or other targets were hit by these drones or infiltrated spike missiles, what is clear, as we'll go through a little bit later, is that the overall suppression and destruction of enemy air defense effort the Israelis appear to have undertaken was at least good enough that large-scale airstrikes deep into the country began almost immediately. While the balance of Israeli target priorities appear to have shifted over time, on the 13th of June specifically, most Israeli targets appear to have fallen into one of 5 categories. Systems and platforms associated with Iranian air defense capabilities, largely concentrated along the western border for understandable reasons. Iranian surface-to-surface missile launchers, as well as supporting facilities. Infrastructure critical to Iran's nuclear program, primarily the Natanz facility on June 12th. And then also key Iranian personnel falling into one of 2 categories. Senior military commanders, and scientists and engineers associated with Iran's nuclear program. To give you a rough idea of how those strikes were reportedly distributed, I've got a map from the ISW on the right there, although given the nature of the subject matter, please treat that as at best very roughly indicative. I'd suggest that along with those infiltration attacks on Iran's air defense systems and the fact the Israelis were apparently able to operate drone factories in the Iranian capital for a period of time before launching their operation, the accurate targeting of a number of Iranian leaders in the opening stage of the attack point to a significant Israeli intelligence penetration of the country. After the first few days, there had been a number of major job openings in the Iranian command staff. The commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the IRGC's aerospace forces had both been removed from their positions, as had 2 members of the Armed Forces General Staff, Major General Rashid and the Chief of Staff of the Iranian military, while a senior advisor to Iran's supreme leader had reportedly been critically injured. As a general rule, these are not the kind of individuals you'd expect to publish public itineraries, and many were hit in an area of Iran you would expect to have some of the strongest air defences, suggesting both the Israelis had access to the kind of real-time data necessary to target these individuals in real time, and also the ability to strike through Iran's integrated air defence system. As a side note, many of these individuals were rapidly replaced, although the replacement chief of staff was reportedly killed by another Israeli strike roughly 4 days into the job. A caveat to put in place, though, about the early stages of the Israeli air campaign, especially those strikes travelling far into the east of the country, is I'd argue that just because strikes were occurring, we can't conclude that Israeli aircraft were safely able to navigate all of Iran's airspace. Israel possesses a significant stockpile of air-launched standoff munitions. We saw some of them used in 2024, and we have evidence they've been used again. So while we can be fairly confident the Iranian air defence system took a bit of a battering in the opening stages of the operation, I'd argue that what we've seen in recent days may be more the result of the steady degradation of that Iranian air defence network in subsequent days, as opposed to all being down to a single devastating day one alpha strike using a bunch of spikes and off-the-shelf drones. Which brings us to the military campaign as we see it now, more than a week after the commencement of Israeli airstrikes. And here what I want to do, instead of going day by day or looking at each individual strike, because there are plenty of channels out there that do something like that if you're after that level of detail, is break the overview of the current situation up into three critical questions. 1. To what extent does Israel actually have air superiority over Iran, and have they suffered any losses in the process? 2. How successful has Iran been with its ballistic missile attacks on Israel in response? And thirdly, how much damage is Israel actually doing with its air campaign? What are the potential limitations there? And how may that have fed into Washington's decision to ultimately launch a strike directly? I wanted to start with the question of air superiority because, believe it or not, this issue is officially contentious, with Prime Minister Netanyahu saying on June 16th, quote, "The Israeli Air Force controls the skies over Tehran. This changes the entire campaign," end quote. Iran, meanwhile, claims to have shot down large numbers of Israeli aircraft. I think we're up to 4 F-35s at last count. And on the 18th of June, the IRGC reportedly issued a statement claiming, quote, "Tonight's missile attack showed that we have gained complete control over the skies of the occupied territories," meaning Israel, end quote. Oh, and we also saw a claim to air superiority by a party that wasn't officially involved in kinetic actions at the time, with US President Donald Trump posting a statement saying, quote, "We now have complete and total controls of the skies over Iran," end quote. But going back just to the Israeli and Iranian claims for a moment, where does the evidence suggest things actually stand in terms of Israel's freedom of air operation over Iran and potential losses? A point to make up front here is that while we do have a number of pieces of visual evidence for the Israelis successfully attacking Iranian air defense systems, like that Hawk or Mossad battery you can see on the right there, compared to the war in Ukraine, where drone footage is pretty much omnipresent across the battlefield and a lot of footage get released, the picture in the case of Israeli operations in Iran is much more patchy. That is, the gap between what's being claimed and what we have visual evidence for tends to be much wider. We have seen some visual evidence of the Israelis launching strikes against Iranian air power, including, no doubt to the great pain of aerospace museum curators around the world, a number of Iran's F-14 Tomcats, as well as other American or American-derived systems like the AH-1 Cobras. Assessing the actual damage to Iran's military capabilities, though, is a tad more complicated, because in many cases, it's hard to know how much this stuff actually worked. A number of the Tomcat airframes, for example, that were hit in these strikes, don't appear to have moved from their spots in the satellite images for years. And I've talked in the past about some of the challenges Iran has faced in keeping Shah-era military equipment flying. Evidence for Israeli aircraft being destroyed by Iranian air defences, by contrast, is even sparser. Officially, Iranian sources claim to have shot down 4 Israeli F-35s, captured a female Israeli pilot, and a number of international publications were quick to run with the story, crediting Iran as the first country to ever shoot down a 5th-generation fighter in combat. A distinction presumably necessary to make because the American military has proven perfectly capable of destroying plenty of 5th-generation fighters outside of combat, and the Ukrainians have succeeded in hitting at least one Russian honorary 5th-generation fighter, a Sukhoi 57, with a long-range drone attack while it was on the ground. The official Israeli position at time of recording is that the Iranian shoot-down claims are bullshit, and the evidence provided so far by the Iranian government, which remember claimed to have at least one Israeli pilot in custody, is a bit thin. And because the internet abhors an information vacuum, that seems to have left room for some online to generate evidence to fill the void. I repeatedly saw the image on the right there, for example, circulating online. It made it into at least one article with the caption, "Image of the alleged F-35 shootdown is circulating on social media." And at the risk of sounding a little bit like I have a mini rant here, while there are always going to be things in conflicts that are very difficult or impossible to verify for media trying to cover it, you'd hope that claims were at least subject to the sniff test. To paraphrase an old quote, if someone claims it's raining and another person claims it isn't, the job of the press isn't to report both claims, it's to stick their head outside and find out whether or not it's raining. Some things can be easily verified, including the fact that that is not a bloody F-35. On the left there for you, I've helpfully included 3 images of actual F-35s, including one after a crash, and on the right, the AI slop in question. As you can see, there are a couple of points that should raise question marks. Despite this being a crashed aircraft, the engine is still either glowing or running. The markings are completely wrong for an Israeli aircraft. The ground around the aircraft is miraculously unharmed, given the fact an aircraft has crashed, and oh yeah, the entire shape of the jet is wrong and the vertical stabilizer is backwards. So unless someone found a crashed F-35, disassembled it, and then partially reassembled it with some other random junk in another location and then photographed that, then what we are looking at here is not an alleged shoot-down of an F-35, it's a likely AI hallucination of something vaguely resembling a crashed jet. This one looks a little bit more like an F-35, barring some very strange features like the weird fuselage extension, and the fact that it's apparently the size of a small skyscraper. Seriously, the people in this image already look big enough to throw some of those vehicles or Hulk smash those buildings in the bottom left, but they are positively dwarfed by the bloody F-35 kaiju variant that's apparently crashed in this nondescript field. I'm harping on this stuff, not just because it's easy to beat up on low-quality AI slop, but to provide a warning about the era we're clearly starting to enter. Yes, a lot of AI crap is still relatively easy to distinguish from the real thing if you know the kind of things to look for. But there are 2 massive warnings to attach to that. 1, it's often the case that some people are fooled or appear to be fooled, and the overall quality of this material is likely to get better over time. In that sense, perhaps, we might be enjoying the last stages of an era where you can at least mostly usually trust the stuff that you see online. Being able to easily identify fakes because the people have 7 fingers and terrible anatomy is one thing. Needing specialised software to identify it is another, and eventually there's no guarantee that even that'll work. In an era where the creation of high-quality fake images and even high-quality fake videos becomes incredibly cheap, easy and accessible to actors around the world, I think there's every chance that verification becomes increasingly difficult and trust increasingly valuable. But thankfully, for the moment, that's a philosophical question for when the fakes are actually good, which these ones aren't. And so, besides the Iranian government say-so, for the moment we don't have any concrete evidence of any manned Israeli aircraft being shot down during these operations. That's not to say there hasn't been a significant cost to the Israeli combat fleet. I just suggest that at the moment, it probably takes the form of additional flying hours and imputed losses rather than combat losses. It's important to emphasise that by the standard of the assets that the Israeli Air Force has available, this has really been a bit of a kitchen sink operation. You're talking about a scenario where an Air Force that only has a couple of hundred combat aircraft to begin with might be sortying a triple-digit number of aircraft for strikes against Iran almost nightly. The turnaround time for a lot of these airframes is going to be tight. I suspect the Red Bull is flowing fairly freely among the maintainers, and it's important to remember that a lot of Israeli aircraft, A, have already been putting in a lot of flight hours since October 2023, and B, many of the aircraft in the fleet were quite old to begin with. By Israel's own reporting, the sortie rate into Iran in recent days is considerably lower than it was at the beginning of the operation, suggesting we might be looking at an operational tempo that the IAF can maintain over a longer period of time. But if you take a longer-term view of the cost of the campaign, it might be the Iranians don't actually have to shoot down any Israeli aircraft in order to extract a bit of a tax on its readiness and ability to fight going forward. That's not to say the Iranians haven't shot anything down from the Israeli side. The only issue is, I'd argue it probably represents a better sign for the Israelis than it does for the Iranians. Because so far the confirmed identified wrecks I've seen from Iranian sources are slow, unmanned platforms. Things like the Hermes on the right there. That's interesting because this isn't a particularly survivable platform. It's a roughly 1-ton subsonic, not particularly stealthy drone that in terms of mass and performance is in the same rough class as something like the Turkish TB2. The interesting part there isn't that it was shot down, but that the Israelis felt comfortable using it in Iranian territory at all. Given how vulnerable these drones are, at this stage of the war, you would never expect to see the Ukrainians, for example, using one of their TB2s over the front line against the Russians. And the Americans have shown that you can lose subsonic, non-stealthy drones like the MQ-9, even to opponents like the Houthis. So a platform like this being used over Iranian airspace either indicates the IAF considered this platform completely disposable, or represents a stunning act of disrespect towards the surviving Iranian air defense system. It's also worth noting that the drone appears to have been armed. Near the wreckage, according to Iranian footage, you can see what appears to be a drone-adapted glide bomb. That's the Mikholit. It's a relatively low-cost option for drones to engage light targets like exposed personnel, unarmoured vehicles, or even soft targets like air defense systems. What that indicates is that these drones might be being used in a ground attack role, and some of the footage we've seen released from Israeli sources looks consistent with a drone-initiated attack. And so while the details are sparse, just as cases of the Ukrainians successfully using TB2s against Russian targets in the early stage of the invasion represented a serious issue with Russian air defences at the time, the fact the Israelis feel comfortable even trying to hit targets inside Iran using Micholit might also suggest a belief, at least on their part, that the Iranian air defence system ain't doing so good. We also have a number of other pieces of evidence that all seem to point in the same direction. Repeated Israeli strikes relatively deep into Iran, repeated strikes against what should be defended targets, like nuclear complexes or the Iranian capital. Images like the one you see on the right here, an Israeli F-15 Eagle outfitted for just about maximum range, conformal fuel tanks, 3 drop tanks, and then a relatively light AMRAAM and Sparrow air-to-air missile load. You almost certainly wouldn't set an Eagle up like that if your goal was just to do home defence around Israeli airspace. Instead, it's consistent with you wanting to fly that jet a long, long way, likely into Iran proper. There also might be some clues in the munitions being used. Images like this one reportedly showing an F-16 being prepared for a raid on Iran, notably, of course, with a significant load of additional fuel, but also an offensive payload of 2 BLU-109s. For those of you not familiar, that's absolutely not a standoff munition. It's not even a winged system like JDAM-ER. It's a relatively simple, adapted dumb bomb bunker buster with a guidance kit. That's the kind of loadout you put on an F-16 if you expect it to have to crack a relatively hard target, but you expect it to be able to get close enough in order to do so. Now, of course, it's technically possible that all of this is an elaborate hoax. None of this has anything to do with Operation Rising Lion. But putting it all together at this stage, I'm relatively comfortable saying the following. We can't know for sure how much damage the Iranian air defence system has taken, but while I have my views on that, I'd suggest it's not central to the key findings either way. What we can say is the Israelis appear to have been able to consistently generate large numbers of sorties against priority targets, sometimes deep into Iranian airspace, around the Iranian capital and sensitive Iranian military sites, and that critically, they apparently feel comfortable operating relatively vulnerable drones and non-stealthy 4th-generation fighters with heavy, relatively short-range weapons payloads inside Iranian airspace to attack Iranian targets. If you reach a point where you're being consistently JDAM'd by 40-year-old aircraft carrying so much additional fuel they blur the distinction between fighters and tankers, then technical definitions aside, your air defence system probably isn't doing its job. And for the moment, that appears to be the level of operational freedom the IAF has gained over much of Iran. There is no doubt still going to be a surface-to-air missile threat, as demonstrated by the fact that a drone was shot down, and Iran is known to have a large inventory of manpads as well as short and medium-range air defence systems. But for the moment, I think it's fair to suggest that the Israelis do enjoy air superiority over at least most of Iran and have demonstrated a continuing freedom to strike at least across most of the country. That doesn't mean they've demonstrated an ability to destroy all of their targets, but we'll come back to that a little later on. Because for the moment, I want to pivot to Iran's military response, which so far has overwhelmingly taken the form of medium-range ballistic missile attacks against Israeli territory. Alongside the use of proxies, ballistic missiles appear to have long played a critical role in Iran's military strategy. An older 2022 US estimate put the Iranian inventory at around 3,000 ballistic missiles, although not all of those would have had the range to target Israel. More recent Israeli estimates put the number of operational systems at closer to 2,500, while as for production rate, one of the most recent estimates we have is from the United States of roughly 50 missiles per month. Wherever the total inventory actually fell within or near those ranges, given the size of the Iranian economy, that kind of ballistic missile arsenal would have represented a significant dedication of resources. It also produced a vast array of different types of missiles, of different capability levels and cost, with many, but not all of them, appearing to have seen significant use against Israel already. As of June 16th, we were still seeing claims come out of Iran that the country had only used older missiles in its attacks to date. And while that statement should probably come with a bit of an asterisk, given the fog of war in place, there might be a kernel of truth to it. The Iranian government does claim to have fired some of its most recent and modern missile designs, including the Fatah, although I note the public usage in that system did happen after that statement about older missiles being used had already been made. And based on recent Iranian claims, I think it's fair to say they're now using a very, very wide cross-section of their available missile designs. In any case, what we unambiguously have seen is hundreds of Iranian medium-range ballistic missiles being fired, beginning with roughly 200 on the 13th of June, and another roughly 300 since. That kind of frequency and intensity of attack, using relatively high-end ballistic missile threats, appears to put a lot of pressure on Israel's missile defense system, both in terms of the ability of the system to reliably intercept all of the targets being thrown against it over a relatively short period of time, and also the country's stock of missile defense interceptors. Before we get into that question of the race to depletion though, there are two broad observations I want to make about the missile campaign so far. The first is that while the Israeli system is clearly intercepting a majority of the targets, there is leakage. I generally advise caution when you're reviewing video or images associated with these missile attacks that appear to show projectiles hitting the ground, because at a high level, there's at least two broad reasons that stuff might make it through. The first is where it isn't actually a failure of the missile defense system per se, but rather the system doing its job. Many missile defense systems, including the Israeli one, are designed so that if they detect a missile is likely to hit an unpopulated or low priority area, in order to save an interceptor, the system will simply allow it to impact. Given how expensive and rare missiles like Arrow are, that kind of discernment in some cases makes sense. The other cases are genuine penetration. Cases where a missile should be intercepted because it's aimed against something worth protecting, but the missile still makes it through despite the system's intent. And so while we'll obviously get more footage and better data over time, for the moment I tentatively put forward at least two observations. One, as expected, the Israeli missile defense system is clearly under significant pressure and isn't perfect when it comes to keeping missiles out, and at the same time the accuracy and strategic usefulness of some of these Iranian missiles leaves a lot to be desired. To illustrate what I mean, let's look at one example. On the 19th of June, the Tehran Times, whose tagline is "Straight Truth," ran the headline, "IRGC strikes hit Amman," so military intelligence and Mossad headquarters in Israel. And fortunately for us, courtesy of an Israeli who apparently recorded the missile strikes, there's a couple of observations we can make. Firstly, before the missile's impact, we see smoke trails consistent with interceptor missiles being launched. Whether that means the interceptors were targeted against other missiles that they successfully intercepted, or if they failed to intercept the ones that ultimately hit, we can't be sure. Having got through the Israeli defense system, however, the results aren't exactly bullseyes. From the perspective of the person filming, you can very clearly see Impact 1 here occurring to the left of a clear identifiable feature, the bridge. Reorienting the overhead view to make things somewhat more intuitive to interpret, our amateur filmmaker is somewhere near the bottom of the image in that circled section there, and the rough zone of the impact based on the location of the road and the bridge is somewhere very roughly around that red star. Basically a case of a high-end long-range weapon system being used by the IRGC to very expensively excavate part of an empty field in Israel. Impact 2 appears to be the most serious, landing approximately here on the overhead map, hitting what the close-up images suggest might be a kind of warehouse, what one Western source described as, quote, "a warehouse in the military intelligence school," end quote. If Impact 1 was a ball, Impact 2 was a strike, 3 and 4 are the pitcher turning around and throwing them directly into the crowd. 3 seems to land again off in an open space to the left-hand side of the viewer, while 4 appears to land in an obvious strategic military target, a sewage treatment plant. Presumably because these missiles might have a bit of an accuracy problem, and not because the order was simply to go blow up some shit in Israel. As far as I can see from this video, nothing came close to hitting the Mossad building, and the degree of dispersion suggests a circular error probable at least in the hundreds of metres, with some commentators suggesting a CEP of more than a kilometre. Meaning in a way, this incident illustrates the challenges for both sides. The Israelis can't stop every missile that Iran fires, but Iran can't come close to guaranteeing that the missiles that do get through will hit anything of military or strategic significance. Iran might be able to target specific buildings or objects, but there's an understanding that a lot of deviation is going to be involved, and when you pull the trigger on these kind of weapons, anything in a relatively wide area might be the ultimate recipient. To counter the Iranian missile attacks, the Israelis haven't just been depending on passive defences. The Israeli Air Force appears to have been actively hunting Iranian missile launch systems, static and mobile, as well as going after supporting infrastructure, like manufacturing facilities and storage locations. As with so many of these things, getting an accurate count on how many launches have been hit is difficult. The Israeli claim as of Monday the 16th was that about 120 launches, roughly a third of Iran's total inventory, had been destroyed, and more recent claims are closer to 50%. The IDF has released a significant amount of footage to support those claims, but as always with footage releases, it needs to be filtered for things like duplicate entries, or situations where the footage seems to suggest that a hit occurred, but not necessarily how much damage was done. There's also the challenge of trying to filter out things like decoys or non-operational vehicles. At time of recording, the visually confirmed count, based on what's available in the open source, is reportedly around 54 launches. So very roughly about a third of those Israeli claims we've heard. Wherever the actual number of destroyed launches sits in that spectrum though, one thing's clear is that we have seen a significant change in the pattern of Iranian missile salvos. On June 13th, the first day after Israeli airstrikes began, Iran reportedly launched around 200 ballistic missiles across 6 barrages. Since that point, as you can see from this chart here from the ISW, the number of missiles fired per day has trended downwards. Recently, the new normal, so to speak, seems to be daily totals in the double rather than triple digits. Although what we obviously can't be entirely clear on is the extent to which that represents suppression by the Israeli Air Force, a shortage of launch systems for Iran's available missiles, the Iranian military actively deciding to ration the missiles it still has available, or some combination of all three. In this war of materiel, though, the pattern and the success of those Israeli airstrikes ultimately does matter. We can be fairly confident, based on what's available in the open source, that Israel's supply of air defense interceptors is under pressure. We can also be fairly confident, even based on Israeli estimates, that Iran still has a significant number of long-range ballistic missiles in inventory. What that would seem to suggest is that if this came down to just a straight race between Israel's stock of interceptors like Arrow and Iran's stock of medium-range ballistic missiles, we would probably expect the Israelis to have to start rationing their missiles and becoming more and more selective in what they engaged, long before the Iranians ran out of munitions to fire. Iran's launches and launch capacity, however, are much rarer commodities. So in terms of determining how much damage the Iranian missile attacks are likely to cause in the end, if this continues to play out, the relevant race is probably not missile versus interceptor, but instead interceptors versus launchers. At a cold, zoomed-out strategic level, though, I'd argue that even though Iran's ballistic missile attacks draw a lot of international attention and have a lot of impact on the lives of those in Israel, I don't think it's entirely clear what they can hope to achieve in a strategic sense using the arsenal they have available. I'd argue that given the demonstrated accuracy or lack thereof of at least some of Iran's missile systems, the closest analogy to what they're essentially doing here is a strategic bombing campaign. They might hit specific targets if a missile is lucky or they fire enough of them, but a majority of the effect for the systems to get through is going to be essentially collateral damage. And in that respect, I'm not sure the amount of high explosive that can be delivered, even against a small nation like Israel, is anywhere close to what it might take to be decisive. Consider the numbers for a moment. If we go by international estimates that suggest that so far Iran has fired roughly 500 ballistic missiles and 1,000 drones against Israel, and the result of those attacks has reportedly been fewer than 50 Israeli fatalities, but we'll round up for the ease of the maths, then so far statistically, Iran is having to fire 10 ballistic missiles for every Israeli fatality. Even if we make some very favourable assumptions for the Iranian arsenal, we assume a near collapse of the Israeli missile defence system and as a result increase those numbers by, say, an order of magnitude. If you compare that to the scale of damage inflicted by other historical strategic bombing campaigns, whether that be North Korea, Vietnam, Germany, Japan, Ukraine with the Russian long-range missile campaign, even adjusted for population size, the numbers are just way, way off, which I think highlights twin observations that we continue to make based on what we see from ballistic missiles in recent conflicts. That ballistic missiles are scary and flexible and do often leak through even advanced air defense systems, but at the same time, they're also very expensive and limited ways to deliver high explosive. And so if your opponent has a significant pain threshold and you don't have the accuracy necessary to hit vulnerable and strategic points, their cost efficiency as a deterrent might come into question. And in the Iranian case, that might be even more significant because of the opportunity cost involved here. Iran, and specifically the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, invested heavily in building up this ballistic missile capability. They built underground storage and production facilities, a fleet of launchers, thousands of missiles, as well as the supporting infrastructure and personnel. Necessarily, given the country's limited resources, that investment had to come at the expense of something else. And so I think it's an open question whether or not Iran has ultimately gotten good value out of all of this investment in its ballistic missile inventory at the cost of neglecting other things like elements of the civilian economy or the regular military. A summary here is that I think we can expect the Iranian missile attacks to continue for as long as the Israeli air campaign continues. I just suggest that it probably won't have enough impact to be the decisive factor in the strategic decisions the Israeli government makes going forward, or when the air campaign ultimately ceases. Which I think brings us back to the Israeli air campaign and a very important question. Having achieved air superiority, what has Israel actually been able to accomplish with it? Because we know the Israeli Air Force has been relatively successful in degrading Iranian air defences, otherwise their aircraft wouldn't be able to fly the way they are. We know they've succeeded in hitting a number of senior Iranian commanders because the Iranians have announced those losses and also the subsequent replacements. We know the Israelis have also targeted and inflicted damage on a range of different pieces of Iranian military infrastructure, including missile production and storage sites, because of satellite imagery that's been made available, although the level of damage between the various sites does obviously vary. But none of that really goes to the core stated goals of the Israeli air campaign itself. In fact, arguably knocking down the air defence systems was just a ticket to play, an enabling act to enable the Israeli Air Force to go and hit its actual targets. What we've heard from the Israeli government so far is that a core goal of this campaign is to diminish Iran's nuclear capabilities. And so I think we have to turn to perhaps the most contested, the most controversial, and one of the most critical aspects of this military campaign: the extent of Iran's nuclear ambitions and industry, the Israeli strikes against it, and the potential impact of the recent US bombing raid. By quick way of introduction though, let me just say this. At the core of the international anti-proliferation effort lies a basic, fundamental problem. In the grand scale of what modern nation-state actors can accomplish, building a nuclear bomb just isn't that hard. At the end of the day, there are things you can do with nuclear weapon design that can get complicated or expensive: very capable delivery systems, miniaturization, better or specialized yields, that kind of thing. But ultimately, the science and engineering of taking a massive fissile material and making it go bang is mid-1940s technology. And so to most countries, the biggest barriers to weaponizing a nuclear device isn't going to be the basic science, technology, and engineering component. It's going to be the accessibility of weapons-grade fissile material, generally meaning either plutonium or highly enriched uranium. And in Iran's case, as we'll see in a moment, almost all of the attention is on that latter category. In some respects, Iran has actually had a nuclear program for more than half a century. Ironically enough, the country started up a nuclear program with American support in a period of time where it was still run by the Shah. That effort obviously lost American support after the Islamic Revolution, but even according to the Iranians themselves, the nuclear ambitions of the country didn't die there. In the context of the horror that was the Iran-Iraq War, the Islamic Republic is generally assessed to have begun a nuclear weapons program. That was officially shelved in 2003. And from that point, Iran has continued to insist that its nuclear program is entirely peaceful. A core objection that many other nations that didn't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon had, however, was that a civilian nuclear program is a pretty good stepping stone towards a military one, particularly when that program includes not just building nuclear reactors, but also building up enrichment infrastructure. Overly simplified science lesson for a moment: naturally occurring uranium is overwhelmingly made up of two isotopes: uranium-238, which tends to make up more than 99% of it, and then a much smaller percentage of uranium-235. From a physics perspective, uranium-238 is the boring one, useful for making things like armour-penetrating projectiles, for example. But uranium-235, that's the more excitable one, the one that makes nuclear power generation and some nuclear weapons as we know them possible. Enrichment is the process of taking uranium and using various processes to increase the percentage of uranium-235 in the mix. The original Manhattan Project took a bit of a shotgun approach to learning how to do enrichment efficiently and tried multiple methods at the same time, but for the Iranians, the question was basically already a solved problem, and they jumped straight to centrifuge technology. Enrich uranium up to a single-digit percentage of uranium-235, and you've got excellent fuel for a number of reactor designs. Jump it up as high as 20, and you have potential civilian applications. Start putting a 9 in front of that number though, and you start going from material that's very good at releasing a lot of energy over a long period of time to something that's very good at releasing a heck of a lot of energy over a very short period of time. There can be niche uses for small quantities of highly enriched uranium for civilian purposes. The production of some medical isotopes in research reactors comes to mind. But having a significant stock of uranium enriched even most of the way to weapons grade is going to make it much easier and much quicker to enable you to relatively quickly make the jump to what you'd need for a functional weapon. And so particularly in the 2000s, we see great concern expressed by a number of nations that Iran would use its enrichment infrastructure to rapidly produce a small amount of weapons-grade uranium in order to rush to nuclear status. That isn't to say the Iranians had decided to actually do that or were actively in the process of building a weapon, just that that was the international fear. The result of that was a 2015 agreement, the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA. That imposed a range of limits on Iranian enrichment activities and put in place some fairly strict monitoring systems. The overall result wasn't to halt the Iranian nuclear program or make it impossible for them to generate nuclear energy, or even to make it impossible for them to hypothetically build a nuclear weapon. Instead, the practical effect was to increase the amount of time it would realistically take the Iranians to rush to a nuclear weapon if they chose to do so. To draw from a relevant American CRS report, quote, the aforementioned JCPOA restrictions constrained Iran's nuclear program so that Tehran, using its declared enrichment facilities, would, at least for 10 years, have needed a minimum of 1 year to produce enough weapons-grade, highly enriched uranium for one nuclear weapon, end quote. In this context, you can call that 1 year period the breakout time, the period it would take a nation to sprint to a nuclear weapon from its starting point if it chose to do so. In 2018, the United States withdrew from the JCPOA, and about a year later, having been re-sanctioned, the Iranians resumed a number of the activities that had previously been barred by that agreement. That included everything from installing additional centrifuges to enriching more and more uranium to higher and higher levels. Obviously, there's not a huge amount of transparency around the current Iranian nuclear program, and I haven't exactly been to Iran to inspect any of their reactors or storage sites. But one of our best recent indicators as to where the Iranians likely were in terms of stockpiling and nuclear activities was a report by the International Atomic Energy Agency. This is the arm of the United Nations responsible for monitoring these kind of things. It has a board of 35 nations. I think the presidency is currently held by Ghana. And on the 12th of June, the Board of Governors voted for the first time to find Iran in breach of its non-proliferation obligations. A majority voted yes, a number abstained, and 3 voted against: the Russian Federation, People's Republic of China, and Burkina Faso. More important from our perspective, however, is probably the relevant IAEA report. It pointed out that, quote, since 16 February 2021, the agency has not been able to verify Iran's total enriched uranium stockpile. However, based on what they could determine and figures that Iran itself provided, they estimated that as of 17 May 2025, quote, Iran's total enriched uranium stockpile was 9,247.6 kilograms. They noted that figure represented a 953 kilogram jump over the last quarter, and critically, that the enrichment profile of that stockpile had changed. The reason this might have sparked concern in some observers is twofold. One, the pace of the increase in the most enriched category, and secondly, the fact that that higher enrichment level, 60%, is very short on relevant civilian applications and fairly long on potential value in a nuclear breakout scenario. It's also worth noting that in the past, the IAEA reported that it detected signs of uranium particles enriched as high as 83.7% when working in Iranian facilities. But as far as their tracking of bulk stockpiles go, 60% is the top of the chart. As the agency put it in its report, quote, the significantly increased production and accumulation of highly enriched uranium by Iran, the only non-nuclear weapon state to produce such nuclear material, is of serious concern, quote. This goes to part of the reason why I'd argue some of the debate we've seen in the media about Iran's nuclear program sometimes represents people sort of arguing past each other, because there are really 2 separate questions here. The first was Iran's breakout time, how close it was to technically being able to assemble 1 or more atomic devices. The second question is whether they'd actually taken the decision to try and put all those pieces together and actually build a bomb. And most of the public assessments we've seen by intelligence agencies outside Israel is that the answer to that question is likely very close and no respectively. As the Director for Non-Proliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association put it, quote, Iran has been at a near-zero breakout for months. Similarly, the assessment that Iran could develop a crude nuclear weapon within a few months is not new, end quote. However, in the same article, she also noted that, in her view, Israel's Prime Minister, quote, did not present any clear or compelling evidence that Iran was on the brink of weaponizing, end quote. Essentially then, what might have been changing with this enrichment pattern was how many bombs Iran could rapidly build if it chose to build them, and how much effort and time would be necessary to get there if they did. By IAEA benchmarks, that stockpile of 60% enriched uranium would probably be sufficient for about 9 weapons if enriched up to 90%, which obviously was of immense concern to the Israelis. But there is a distinction in the argument between Iran's capacity to go nuclear and the decision to finally go nuclear. To use a crude comparison, if you buy a flat-pack desk from IKEA, but you leave it in the box and don't assemble it, do you or do you not have a desk? How about if you buy the desk, but you don't have an Allen key, but you know how you could get one if you needed it? That's probably a very rough assessment of where the Iranian nuclear program was sitting before this bombing campaign started. Being in a position where, to quote the US Director of National Intelligence, the country could, quote, produce a nuclear weapon within weeks to months, end quote, but not a position where it was conclusive they decided to actually do so. A significant part of Israel's effort then appears to have been directed at removing Iran's ability to potentially make those last critical enriching and technical steps. A number of high-level Iranian nuclear scientists have been very publicly assassinated. The Natanz facility, which housed a majority of Iran's centrifuges, has been bombed. The so-called pilot fuel enrichment plant, which included a number of advanced centrifuges capable of enriching uranium up to 60%, had reportedly been destroyed. And the power supply and above-ground components for the main fuel enrichment plant had also, as you can see from the image on the right there, been hit. The head of the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, suggested that the strikes on those facilities may have caused damage to the centrifuges held below ground, but there's obviously no way to confirm. And that military challenge to the Israelis of effectively engaging and assessing damage to underground facilities was far from limited to Natanz. The facility you can see on the right there is Fordo. The UN report indicates it's responsible for the vast majority of Iranian enrichment up to that 60% level, or at least it may have been until recent events. What that would suggest is that if the Iranians did decide to make the jump from 60% to weapons grade, Fordo would potentially provide them with the technical capability to do it, which presumably would have put it near the top of the Israeli Air Force's target list. The issue, however, from an Israeli perspective, is that it's buried under a mountain. And all the air superiority in the world won't change the basic physics of your target being buried under dozens of metres of rock, dirt and concrete. And that challenge of that buried facility at Fordo, I think, leads into another extended point, which is basically what I'm calling the munitions or payload gap. The issue that, yes, Israel has demonstrated the capability to take air superiority, but there are still question marks over their ability to use that air superiority to inflict enough damage to represent a decisive strategic result. The issue they face is the IAF is still a relatively small air force, primarily reliant on fighter aircraft, that is trying to launch strike operations over very long distances. Even with some mid-air refueling capacity, taking platforms like F-35 and F-16 over those distances imposes restrictions on just how much payload you can carry. Basically, the IAF can get to Iran, but there's a limit to how much ordnance it can take per sortie. And from the perspective of needing to service targets, I think that leaves the IAF with two critical challenges. Targets that are too numerous to effectively strike, and on the other hand, sites that are so hardened that the weapons the Israelis have available to them can't readily crack them. As we flagged earlier, the Israelis do have some bunker busting capacity, but there is a massive difference between being able to hit something a couple of metres underground and Fordo, because for all of humanity's technological advancement, as far as defensive technologies go, rock and dirt remain overpowered. And so potentially engaging a facility buried under 80 to 90 metres of rock, dirt and concrete is simply beyond the capability of a vast majority of conventional weapon systems out there, with at least one potential exception. This thing is the MOP, and not the kind your janitor uses. The Massive Ordnance Penetrator is a nearly 14-tonne bunker buster with publicly cited penetration figures of around 60 metres. And while Israel's roughly 2-tonne munitions might not be enough to do the job, the ability to set off more than 2 tonnes of high explosive, perhaps 60 metres underground, might have looked like something that could potentially open up that option. However, in the context of this operation, there are at least two complicating factors. The first is when it comes to bunker busters, penetration figures are more like guidelines than actual rules and heavily context dependent. You can say a bomb will penetrate 60 metres into the earth, but ultimately the earth does get a vote. Drop the MOP into relatively soft clay and it might penetrate significantly further than 60 metres. Drop it into solid reinforced concrete or hard rock, and it's very much a case of your mileage may vary. So complicating factor number one was the fact it wasn't clear that even the MOP would work against a target like Fordo, and even if it would, there was complicating factor number two. Israel doesn't have it. One thing that seems to have been lost in some of the recent media discussion is there was at one point a significant push in the United States to get Israel the MOP, and that back in 2015, that argument had advocates on both sides of the American political aisle. There were arguments by Republican figures. The article on the right there was by Democratic Senator Cory Booker, and this one by General David Petraeus, all arguing for the same thing. Instead, for the moment, there's only one force on the planet, the United States Air Force, that has this kind of capability and inventory, and they also have a platform technically capable of carrying two of these things at the same time that could realistically make it through what's left of Iran's air defense system to the site to deliver them, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. I said in this episode I'd focus on the more military aspects than the geopolitics of the situation, but in this case, the two solely overlap. As the Israelis have demonstrated, there's a lot they can do to impact Iranian military capabilities by themselves. But if you're wondering why we might have seen so much public pressure from the Israelis for the Americans to join in direct strikes against Iranian targets, the combination of the B-2, the MOP, and targets like Fordo are probably a significant part of the answer. Israel's ambassador to the United States even went on Fox News and said, quote, "This entire operation really has to be completed with the elimination of Fordo," end quote. Statements like that seem to imply an expectation of at least some degree of direct US military intervention. But as the opening stages of the Israeli air campaign played out, the world was left guessing as to whether or not we'd actually see it. Over the weekend, we got our answer with what the US apparently dubbed Operation Midnight Hammer. As I noted earlier, in the interest of time, most details of this operation probably belong in a future episode. But the Spark notes is that we saw an operation that involved American B-2 Spirit stealth bombers flying from the continental United States to hit targets in Iran, where they apparently dropped a number of MOPs and then safely returned home. The operation was obviously much, much bigger than the bombers, especially when you consider the number of tankers necessary to make a mission like that possible. But it also included a fairly notable attempt at deception. Before the attack was launched, the world saw, and many sources reported on, a flight of B-2s taking off from their base and then heading in the opposite direction, flying west on a course that many presumed was taking them towards Diego Garcia or Guam. Meanwhile, the actual strike package headed east, their stealth features keeping them mostly undetected, although it is possible they may have been detected by a peer-level adversary using some highly advanced technology, namely Dave here on Twitter, who says he lives in Warsaw, Missouri, and counted a bunch of B-2s flying over his house heading east. If he did spot them, then I guess that's proof that sometimes even stealth features are no match for a bloke equipped with ears and the Mark I eyeball. The Iranian air defence system, however, appears to have been lacking its own Dave from Missouri, with the US claiming the bombers made it in, along with 30 Tomahawk cruise missiles fired by the US Navy, delivered the intended payload, and then returned home safely. A major debate about this operation, likely even within some intelligence circles, is exactly how much damage it did, because interpreting satellite imagery to do BDA is a lot harder when the target is underground. As such, I'll hold off on most of the likely assessments, but just for the curious, I'll flash up some of the before and after images we currently have. This is Isfahan, where US Tomahawks appear to have flattened a number of the structures that weren't hit in the original Israeli attack. At Natanz, where there were question marks over the status of the underground facilities, you can see an entry point for at least one MOP, whereas at Fordo, buried considerably deeper underground, we can see 6 entry points. I'm flashing those up on screen here, clustered into 2 groups of 3. As for the site as a whole, you have the before image on the left, the after image on the right, and once again, I've circled those entry points just for reference. Obviously, these images will raise a lot of questions, like how much damage was done, what was actually present in the facility at the time, what were the Iranians able to evacuate or not evacuate before the strike, etc. And as promised, we'll come back to those points as more information and analysis becomes available. For now, though, there's really only 2 broad points I want to make about what we saw out of this US operation. The first is that in a purely military technical sense, it demonstrated a fairly impressive capability. The US was able to get a significant number of bombers, project them halfway around the world, use them to drop munitions that basically no other nation has an equivalent to, drop them in what looked like some very tight clusters, and then get the aircraft home safely. Whatever the strategic impacts this operation ultimately end up being, from a tactical perspective, it was very impressive. Meanwhile, at the strategic level, it gave us a bit of a clue about where the US currently sits on the intervention spectrum, if you like. As you probably noticed from a range of geopolitical events we've covered, nations don't really seem to do the declaration of war thing anymore. Instead, we operate in a world where there appears to be a spectrum, from complete peace, through civilian competition, to grey zone warfare, and then in a wedge, somewhere short of a full-scale conventional invasion or a nuclear exchange, there are these conflicts where we've seen actors take kinetic actions against each other, like firing missiles into each other's territory, and then de-escalate and potentially do it all again later. The US had choices ranging from staying out of this conflict to going all in. It chose something in between, because I'd suggest that if Washington's expectation was that now full-scale war would break out between the United States and Iran, the attacks would have been much wider ranging. They would presumably have gone after as many of Iran's offensive capabilities as possible, maybe percussion attacks against its command and control systems, essentially attempting to disrupt Iran's ability to, for example, strike back against US troops in the region. Instead, what we saw was a quite limited attack against 3 specific targets, all tied to the Iranian nuclear program. What that actually means for the Iranian nuclear program, the risks or how this all plays out in the coming days, though, is still very much in the time will tell category and beyond the timeline I want to cover this episode. So if we put a pin in the timeline there for a moment and instead try and zoom out, what are some of the broader observations we can make about the military aspects of this conflict as it's played out since the 13th of June? Because even through the fog of war and with a lot of analysis still to be done, I think there's a couple that might be worth tentatively surfacing. The first, that once again, we've seen a real-world demonstration of the potential of an intelligence organisation sneaking drones into a target country before an attack is launched, and then using them to go after specific targets that other weapons might not potentially have been able to get to. For Ukraine, the drones in the intelligence operation were as part of a counter-air campaign. For the Israelis, apparently it was part of a SEAD-DEAD effort to enable an air campaign. But in both cases, the core concepts and the risk they imply remains the same. And if any major military isn't looking at these experiences and asking how they can protect their own force, their own assets against this style of operation, then there's an argument to suggest that someone should, start, and start quickly. Observation 2 is that after years of observing the war in Ukraine, with its mutual air denial by both sides' air defence systems, the Israeli operation arguably demonstrates the potential of what a modern air force can achieve if opposing air defences are destroyed or suppressed. Over much of Iran, the IAF appears to have been able to pick its targets relatively freely, and I think we've seen some demonstrations of what this kind of air power can and cannot achieve. For example, while it's still very early days, it does appear that Israel's campaign to hunt Iranian missile launch vehicles looks very, very different to the results we saw back during the Scud hunt of 1991. That may well be down to just the omnipresence and superiority of modern sensors and networking, meaning that even when these vehicles don't have to expose themselves for particularly long, they're easy to locate, and thus easier to target than they were on the less transparent battlefield of the early 1990s. But it's also clear that Israeli air power has run up against some pretty significant limits. It clearly didn't have fantastic options when confronted with very heavily hardened facilities, while also having to contend with the sheer scale involved, the size of Iran and its population, the distances involved, and the soft cap that essentially imposes on what effects can actually be achieved. The Israelis have no doubt been able to take a pretty significant chunk out of some of Iran's conventional military capabilities. They've been able to strike industrial facilities, hit missile launchers, and effect some high-level command changes, especially in the IRGC. But it's hard to see at this point how they could impose a decisive strategic effect without eventually going to negotiations. The idea of trying to bomb a country into regime change, for example, has a fairly abysmal historical record. In other words, I'd argue we've seen a military validation of the kind of things air power can do, but also a reminder of some of the things it can struggle to do. Likewise, the Iranian experience with their missiles so far illustrates both effect and limitation. They have been able to use their missile arsenal to get some warheads through the Israeli missile defense system and effect some degree of pain on their opponent. But it's evidently so far fallen well short of the level of pain necessary to compel their opponent to change their approach. Iran's missiles have been able to hit Israeli cities, but they haven't been able to stop Israeli aircraft bombing Iranian targets. Although I'd be careful about potentially overlearning any lessons out of that experience, given that from a technical performance perspective, not every country's missile arsenal is going to look like the Iranian one. Then I think there are a range of areas where it's not so much about lessons learned as about lessons that we're about to learn. How effectively can you damage a nuclear program like this using air power? How quickly can one be reconstituted? And what does the world and the wider non-proliferation regime look like, where threshold, or states considering becoming threshold nuclear states, will clearly have to consider what their risk profile and calculus might be around the possibility of nations taking actions like the one we've just seen. What we're seeing is still a very uncertain picture, where the status of Iran's nuclear program isn't fully understood, the location of its enriched uranium stockpile isn't publicly understood, its future military intentions and retaliation options are not yet clear, and I expect many of us are going to be waiting somewhat nervously to see how this all ends. Many of the tactical and operational outcomes of the opening stages of Israel's operation have already become clear. They've seized air superiority over the skies of much of their opponent's territory and put them squarely on the back foot. At this stage, even just rebuilding Iran's air defense and missile capabilities up to their pre-operation levels would be a significant undertaking. As for what the final strategic and global outcomes are likely to be, however, that's where it's a case of only time will tell. And okay, brief channel update to close out. Apologies for the one-day delay on this one, but it's always a danger when covering global events, especially potentially globe-shaping ones like this one. In the end, I gave a lot of thought as to how I might comprehensively cover the full breadth of this topic, not just the military aspects of the operation and some of the technical lessons out of it, but the global implications, what this means for other actors, and where things might go for here, both in relation to this conflict and also things like the global non-proliferation regime. In the end, though, I decided the best way to do that was to not do it. Hence the decision to focus on the things I focused on today, with the intention of coming back for a part 2 once things become just a bit clearer on those broader implications. Of course, that's assuming that 2025 doesn't stay true to form, and we see a new series of world-shaping events occur in the coming days and weeks. In any case, thank you very much for your ongoing patience and engagement, and with any luck, I hope to see you all again next week.